Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I don't think there are any, but I'm Dan Pratt, and this is the inaugural Creative Insights for UWL. These are conversations. They're not so much stand and lecture at you, but it's a discussion about research, about practice-based research, how we work as artists, how we work as researchers, and how those things intersect. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Adam Martin, who has come all the way from the University of Huddersfield, and Dr. Remy Martin, who has come all the way from the office. I'll leave you to it.
Thanks very much. All right, thank you very much, Dan, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. We're going to tell you a little bit about what we've been working on for a couple of years, some books that will be out in the world, about how you make music with other people and how people... An element. No, his is a book. Yours is an element. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. But as Dan said, we want to share it with you and for us to talk about it all together, to have discussions. We'll tell you what we've been doing, but also pose some questions that anyone who's interested in how you make an experience making things with other people. We're particularly interested in music and songs, but anything really can get involved. Yes, to double up on that, Adam, thank you so much for coming down from Huddersfield to be with us today, to share amazing work you do, both in practice and in research. And shall we start? We're going to talk a little bit for the start. That's all right, Dan? Yes. All right, good. There are pens and paper for the discussion section. If you want to scribble things down or draw or kind of yourselves create as we're discussing some of these things, we'd really appreciate that as well. All right, Adam, tell us about yourself. Introduce yourself.
Thanks, Remy. Thanks, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So the part of the idea of what we're going to talk about today is the bits of research we've been doing, the journeys along the way, but also how bits of practice intersect with bits of research, how sometimes they're one and the same. So for anyone that's involved in kind of either or both of those camps, there's hopefully bits and resources you can take. So my background is I think I've been working in higher education for about 15 years. I worked for just over a decade at Leeds Conservatoire, which is very practice-based. I did my PhD just before that time in phenomenological observations on music production. So I did a lot of time basically working with very practical musicians, and during that time I got really interested and involved in how musicians work together, particularly how popular musicians work together, and even more specifically how songwriters work together. And over the last 10 years or so, I was lucky enough to be involved in organising and taking part in various songwriting camps across Europe, where I would take students to, it was commonly Copenhagen, I've forgotten all other cities that were involved, Rome, that was nice, and the one in Germany. I'll get it later. But basically taking students to work with students from different countries to make pop songs and write together and observe how unbelievably rewarding that was for some people and how unbelievably awful it was for other people in different rooms. And these things would be happening in rooms next to each other. Some people would leave going, I want to be a professional songwriter for the rest of my life. And other people would kind of go, I want to go home because I hate this experience. So I became really interested in how this environment could be so affective for people, to give a word for later on. So I now work at the University of Huddersfield, so I've been doing more focused research, and I've recently had this book published in Routledge, which is all about these theories of collaborative songwriting, taking theory from creativity literature and from various other fields to try and understand what happens when we work with other people. And it's a culmination of interviews with 19 different professional songwriters from across the globe to try and basically look at what they have in common in terms of how they experience their practice. Aside from that, I do a few other bits. This is a snapshot from a project I'm involved in called Unusual Ingredients, which is about the idea of food and music combined. So it's from, I'll briefly mention it because it has nothing to do with that talk, but it's fun. It's the idea of cross-modality, that when we experience something, it's normally summed together in our heads, in our experience of it. So when we see and hear something, we align them to make it make sense. That means in food and music land, as research, a lot of which from University of Oxford has shown, when we hear certain sounds or certain frequencies or timbres, it can affect the way we taste food and taste drink. So, for instance, if you're tasting chocolate and listening to high-pitched sounds, it will modulate to perceivably taste sweeter. And if you're listening to lower-pitched timbres and brass, it'll taste more bitter, for instance. So as a musician, when I heard that, I was like, well, I need to use that science to make cool stuff. So I, with another collaborator, Jacob Thompson-Bell, we basically made an album of tracks to modulate food so that you could have essentially a eating party or a listening eating party and go through. We made a box set with test tubes of ingredients, which I think is the first food and music album released. And we did a live event where you got little cups to try these ingredients. It's on Spotify. There's the modulators from bitter to sweet and sweet to bitter. So if you've got some dark chocolate, put one piece in your mouth and see if it changes as you taste it. That's that bit. And then aside from that, I also do a lot of electronic music with a project called Nightports on the top right, which is based upon recording one musician and then making all the material from just those sounds. So we did an album with a pianist called Matthew Bourne, and the whole musical work is just cuttings, stretchings, shrinkings of his playing. We did a drum album with a drummer called Betamax from The Comet Is Coming, and then this is a double bass album with a bass player called Tom Herbert, where everything is from that one place and one rule. So those are kind of my backgrounds and interests.
Yeah,
Remy.
Yeah, I'll say a bit about, and the bottom right-hand corner, by the way, this is really the stuff we're talking about today, this small text, this Cambridge element, as they're called, which we're going to share some findings from today that we did together. A little bit about me. I initially, in my career in research and higher education, was interested in the question, how does music work? Nuts and bolts kind of analysis of music, including rock music. So that's where it started. But then I became increasingly interested, not really in the question of how does music work, i.e. how is it put together, harmony, rhythm, timbre, production, but became fascinated and confused by how people experience this thing. How does it show up for us? So following the kind of how does music work analysis of music stuff, I started to do much more, again, phenomenological work, i.e. interested in felt experience, including about listening to music. It's such a bizarrely, profoundly, deeply, and also sometimes quite normally experiential facet of our life, and it seems a strange thing that we spend so much time doing it. So I became very interested in that. After working actually together for 5 years at Leeds Conservatoire, so funny, we worked in the same office for 5 years, and we only did some research together after I moved to Norway. So that kind of came together. I then went to the Ritmo Centre for the Interdisciplinary Study of Rhythm, Time and Motion in Oslo, in Norway, where I got interested in how people experience live music together. What happens to our bodies and our minds when we are absorbed in music, particularly in live concert settings. And the studies we did there often involved quite large-scale concert experiments in large concert halls, including the Stavanger Symphony Orchestra, including the Danish String Quartet's annual festival, where we did lots of science at one time, basically. We had the audience rigged up with physiological measurements. We had interviews with audience members. We had the musicians on stage recording heart rate, breathing, body motion, all of this stuff. And we kind of tried to combine this crazy amount of data, qualitative and quantitative, to understand what's happening to people when they experience this. And remarkable things happen when people experience music. So that was a lot of like how we experience when we listen to music, when we are receiving it in some way. But we came together while I was out in Oslo at Ritmo to think about the question of how people experience making music, and particularly how people experience making music together in collaborative songwriting settings. That's kind of the trajectory of where we've come to do this work today, that we want to talk about this short little text in the Cambridge Elements series, which, as Adam said, involved talking to songwriters, but it also involved thinking about certain theory, certain perspectives, certain concepts that allow us to understand what it is that's happening when people are experiencing this. The story we're telling you today, I suppose, is quite a straightforward one. that when people make things together, that's a space that's incredibly charged with feeling, with ideas, with emotion, with senses of yourself, with vulnerability, with excitement, with anxiety. The kind of story we're telling today is a very obvious one, but when you dig into it, as we've done these in-depth interviews, thinking theoretically, my gosh, it's a rich thing to think about how people make together. So that's the kind of simple story. Should we do a bit of difficult stuff first? We will kind of position our work. That means thinking about some of the big ideas that drive it, some of the big theory, the big perspectives that drive the approach we've taken to thinking about collaborative music making together. We will then open up the discussion. We'll share with you some of our big headline findings from this little text we've done together and your book, Adam, as well. And we'll invite you to also think about some of these things because they will be familiar to all of you as music makers. So yeah, we have kind of three main points we want to discuss today, don't we? Findings that we've found, and we want to see if they resonate with you in your experience as musicians. I have some students here from our classes. I know they will. We've discussed some of these things. You've experienced them in some ways. Around affective is the key idea here. This feeling, this experience, this experiential stuff of making music together. Not just as if it's in our brains with cognitive thinking or cognitive ideas, I should say, but actually the whole affective, emotional, experiential element to what it is to make music together. Is that a fair reading? All right, should we get into it? We ready? Feeling good?
I've got one more bit of preamble.
Go on then.
The one more bit of preamble was basically to separate, and for us also to structure in our heads what we wanted to do with this time with you all, where we hope that from today we'll be able to share some hopefully new ways to think about creativity. For me, this project and the bits we've spoken about leading up to it have really changed a lot of what I think from a pedagogical sense, but also how I teach and experience it, and that I am very conscious and hopeful I am a better collaborator because of being aware of these things. Thinking about affect, thinking about how vulnerability plays a role in the room is really crucial, and from observing collaborations that go wrong, it really helps you to figure out the various parameters are at play and how it can lead to really dangerous or destructive behaviors collaboratively. We'll hopefully share some resources for teaching and learning about creativity, and also if you want any more specific sources from myself or Remy afterwards, we're very happy to. We'll hopefully provide you with opportunities to discuss and share creative experiences. It would be really nice to hear about everyone's thoughts on these areas of discussion, and hopefully a chance for you all to maybe speak to or meet new people about these topics. Selfishly, from our point of view, what we hope to get is a chance to chat about the work we've been doing, to see if it kind of makes sense in this forum of saying it out loud rather than writing it down, and to hear all of your ideas pertaining to how these areas interact with your creative lives.
And yeah, in the discussions, we'll chat about it perhaps around those two tables. So come down if you're interested in anything. You at the back there, students, join if you want to, bring your drinks. But there's also bits of paper and stuff. Write down ideas, enact these ideas. We want to hear these things, and to record them on the paper as well as kind of through the talk and the audio would be great. All right, deep breath. Are we ready? Bit of theory, bit of how we approached doing this book, a bit of how we approached interviewing songwriters.
We haven't decided who's doing what slide, so it's a real moment of roulette for each one, and Remy's giving me a shitter here. So the way in which we approach this project is, for me, the one that makes the most sense as a researcher, is with a phenomenological attitude. And there are many different interpretations and variations of a phenomenological attitude to us. At its most simplest, it meant that for us to understand what's happening, we need to hear from the people that are having these experiences. That their experiences, their understandings, articulations, and interpretations of experience is the crucial data point. It's the crucial thing we need to understand and the thing we need to focus on. So for us, observing sessions wasn't really that useful, and we didn't do it because that's not really learning about their experience, that's just watching them have an experience. So instead, our whole focus would be on talking to people, getting rich articulation of what it's like to feel like they feel, and then triangulating that. So we start from that phenomenological attitude, which puts experience as central in everything we do. With that as well, and we'll touch on it in a little later in terms of method, but we wanted to speak to people that do this every day as a jobbing, working songwriter. We didn't want or need essentially big celebrity songwriters, because their experience of songwriting collaboratively is a mile away from the normal people's experience of songwriting, where you're trying to get cuts, you're trying to get position, etc., rather than everyone doing what you say all the time. So we wanted to stay very close to the ground and so get a spread of a sample that represented what it is to be a working songwriter. Sorry, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, and phenomenology or phenomenological method is often understood as you're trying to understand people's subjective experiences, their own experiences, which is partly true. You're trying to get rich descriptions of experience. But that's not really what phenomenological analysis either. Yes, you want to get rich descriptions of how people experience their world, how they experience making music with other people. But you do that in the service of understanding shared structures of experience, i.e. the things that frame other, more than one person's experience of that thing. That's often a misunderstanding you see about phenomenology, that you want an individual person's experience. You want that, and you want many of them, in order to understand what things do we share in our experiences of approaching these things, for example, making songs together. So that's a very key point. It's not just about the life world, as we call it, the everyday lived experiences where we feel things, we think things, we are drawn to things, we are impressed by things, we're fascinated, we make things, but also how more than one person does that and experiences it in some way. Phenomenology foregrounds a couple of things that I think are absolutely foundational to why music resonates with us, whether it's listening or making it, which is that it's an embodied experience. It is not a disembodied, purely brain or head-based experience, as if you just sit and think in isolation from how you feel. Emotional charges, affective charges, how you feel being with someone. Everyone heard this about the vibe in the room? Yeah, my students are like, you don't let us use the word vibe, Remy. Well, the atmospheres of creation we're really interested in. Spaces where you make music are charged with feeling and potential in that way. So we're trying to get to this stuff, which phenomenology is very, very well placed to do. Phenomenology, as Simon Höfting, the philosopher, says, is in a way the par excellence, the way of understanding lived experience for us. We're really interested in our projects together in creative interactions between peoples and the tools that they use to make music, technologies, instruments, WhatsApp, rooms, stages, desks, all these things, pens, notepads. It's about many, many rich interactions, not just social, but also material as well. Phenomenology is really well placed, I think, to have a rich understanding of our interaction with the world around us as well. So yes, creative interactions between what musicians bring when you walk into a room or an online collaboration with someone else, including skills, tools, behaviors, and feelings. I'm not going to be able to overstate feeling today too much. And nor were the songwriters that we interviewed, and that's how we came to this. But anyway, and how particular locations, social and industrial context, guide what we can do. Give us a sense of agency, what's possible in making music with other people. So the summary is this. We think that phenomenology, caring about experience, individual and shared, gives us a very, very rich way of accessing how this world shows up to people that make music, how they experience it. So we have a phenomenological attitude, an experiential attitude about interactions that cares about the lived feelings, the bodies of musicians, how they move in spaces together, how they experience working with other people. Here's a key term that we're going to return to a lot, and we hope that resonates, because it's a really big one in the book, and it's a thing that came up a lot in the songwriting interviews, is that when you make things with other people, there is an affective allure. We are drawn to things. We are fascinated by things. Things excite us. Certain ideas that another musician has can drive you to think, I've got my own new ideas now. Certain things that another musician might do inspire you to think slightly differently about what's possible for you. In the interviews we've done with songwriters, they're very keen to show that collaboration, yes, extends your possibilities as a musician, but also often that you're guided, you're inspired by the fact these make you feel these fascinations. But the other thing we've seen, which we're going to talk about quite a bit and ask you to think about, is that songwriters in our interviews often talked about the vulnerability of making music together. the anxiety that can come with it, the fear. The affective allure of making music is not just excitement and fun. It's a thing of opening yourself up to potential risk as well. So affective allure, how we are drawn to things in the world, really inspire a lot of music making as well. Phenomenology is another good way of approaching understanding people's experiences, including in creative settings, because, and this is a beautiful kind of conception from the phenomenological tradition from Husserl all the way to now, is that it's not like the world is out there and we're just in our own heads and they're two separate things. As Dan Harvey, a current phenomenologist, said, the focus on phenomenology is the intersection between ourselves and our world. Phenomenologists are often, including Merleau-Ponty, are famous for saying, the world is inside of me and kind of I'm inside of the world. When people make music together, they are profoundly enmeshed in this entanglement of the world around them, of the feelings of other people around them, of the tools and technologies that they're using. So that's part of our phenomenological attitude as well, is to think of this deep, profound involvement of everything around us in some way. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how we went about the kind of methodology or the approach to the book, Adam?
Yeah, I'll keep this quite brief in terms of what we did. But we undertook phenomenologically grounded qualitative research, which is catchy as a name, PGQR. And essentially, if anyone's used or heard of the research method of interpretive phenomenological analysis, rolls off the tongue again. This is a slight deviation from that in that this allows us to gain data through those rich, detailed accounts that Remy spoke about, and also use that data to interact it with existing theory. So we were able to take things that people had in common, descriptions and experiences that people shared, and then say, what does that mean in relation to, for instance, this theory from psychology or this theory from an activism? So we were able to kind of cherry pick ideas and put them into theoretical spaces to see what that brought us in terms of discussion and findings. So we were able to introduce phenomenological theory like affect and things like that, and also atmosphere, which we'll discuss later on. We undertook 9 semi-structured interviews for this project, each of them was about an hour or an hour and 20, which we transcribed and then coded to basically work out what was happening, what each person was saying, and the hidden gems that emerge from that conversation that aren't always the ones you heard in the moment. When you read the transcript, you go, oh, there's something there. So Remy and I both codified those. We looked at what we had and came up with essentially the set of themes that built the framework of the element that we then basically broke down into 3 core chapters. Originally 5, but then we kept shrinking to really what is the essence of what's happening here in these, what we call in that method, experiential themes, things that people have experienced as a shared entity in what they do.
All right. So yes, some of the big concepts that we're working with here come from phenomenology, this kind of philosophical tradition par excellence, that's a confronted experience, how the world shows up for us, how it kind of comes to be for us and how we experience it. But to keep this very short, our work together actually intersects with some current directions in research, not just from phenomenology, that kind of philosophical territory, but from some theories from psychology, which have had a profound impact on how people have understood music making, actually. Not just that it's kind of an information processing kind of information, musical information, brain download, understand, but that we make direct contact with the world. We bump into it. We sense it. Much more direct kind of tactility and perceptual contact with the world around us. And that comes from ecological psychology, the concept of affordance and direct perception. But the other big framework, the big kind of theory direction that we bring into play here, as Adam has mentioned, is enactivism, enactivism, or enactive cognitive science. Again, much more about our direct perceptual contact with the world, how it shows up for us, but also how we kind of sustain our meaningful contact with the world. These are quite grand ideas, and the way of doing this really is not for me to explain them all now. It's for us to look at a few themes from our data, I think, and get a sense of what we mean for these things in the context of music. So let's do it. We're going to say some things, then we're going to discuss some of these ideas. The big idea that we use, one of the big ideas that we use in the book, is called affective framing. Let me start with this. When we talk to musicians, the ones we interviewed for the book, when we ask them to describe how they experienced a musical project, a collaborative project, or describe it for us, they did not describe the process like this. We layered guitars, then we layered drums, then I redid vocals, or we put bass in. They did not describe it like this. When we asked them to describe what was that project like, they said things like this. Oh, I felt so scared when I entered it. When we said, oh, can you describe how that project went with that collaborator? They said things like, at first I felt really vulnerable. Their descriptions were always framed really by their affective kind of experience, their feelings. Emotion was at the center of these descriptions. And Michelle Mays, the philosopher, in her work, reminds us that our experience of the world is so often, or is always, affectively framed in that way. For Michelle Mays and this kind of theory from philosophy, our feelings, our emotional experience are a way that we understand the world around us. They're not just a byproduct. They're not just an outcome. It's not just like, oh, I entered the room and it made me feel that way, but I'm glad I was there. It was that when I entered that room, I understood it partly because how it felt for me to be in that room. So for us, in activism, feelings and emotion and affect are a way that we understand the world. They're not just an after effect of it. They're not just an outcome or a byproduct. Affective framing, the concept, yes, makes us think about the affective allure, the things that we're drawn to in the world because of the way they make us feel. But affective framing works in two ways. Affect, Michelle Mays argues, is always kind of the backdrop to our lives. We're never not experiencing these sensations, these affective attachments to the world around us. They are the kind of veil or filter that we experience the world around us through. We'll get to the concrete stuff in a minute. One more thing. Michelle Mays also says that in our world around us, whether we're making music or whatever, sometimes certain objects become affectively framed. I.e., some musicians talked about how particular musical ideas had a real emotional meaning for them, or emotional attachments. There we are. Affect is a backdrop to our world. It drives our perception. It drives the way we interact with it, and certain things show up to us affectively. For example, this songwriter said this. Shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, sure. So this is Clive, which is a pseudonym. Clive said, I've struggled with anxiety and depression, and I've found that at times where I'm feeling that I'm most anxious or depressed, it can often provide this filter of all of my decision-making and all of my thought processes. It has led to a point where I don't really trust myself in terms of what I'm thinking or some of my judgments, because I don't know whether I think this way about an idea because the idea is not creative enough, or I think the way about an idea at the moment because I hate myself. Slightly paraphrased at the end, sorry. So in this example, we see a clear example of what Remy was speaking about in terms of that veil or frame of affect that Clive labels here as a filter, which came up as an idea in several interviews. This idea for Clive is that his judgment is impaired, his creative and aesthetic judgment is impaired because he's feeling thoughts of self-doubt and also mild self-loathing, where he is then unable to make decisions on things. He goes on after this to talk about how he has to, at these points, defer to a collaborator to choose what ideas to pursue or how to develop them. Because at the moment, at that point in time, he is essentially out of ideas and out of ways to move forward. So at that point, collaboration becomes a tool to get out of that feeling, out of that process, but also it's partly the cause in that collaboration has had this affective frame around Clive. Do you want to add bits?
These are some of the kind of frames, we call them, that a lot of songwriters talked about in our interviews. Again, they weren't describing the process like we did this, then we did this, then we did this. They said things like, I felt so vulnerable when I worked with that person. It was such a scary thing to make music with them. They felt senses of fear came up a lot. It's quite negative attachments to making music for a profession they're doing. Frustration came up a lot in collaborative situations. All experienced this, being frustrated in a collaboration? Yeah. Yes. Anxiety, but also excitement as well. More positively balanced kind of affective frames come about.
It's a 4-to-1 on
4-to-1 of negative stuff and one positive thing about making music with other people. But this is what they came up with. And these are professional songmakers. This was a kind of key theme for them. So yes, the summary being this. Emotional experience is at the center of what these people experience when they make music with people. We did not say to them, please describe your emotions. We said, please describe that project. How does it feel to work with them? Surprisingly, remarkably, kind of stupefyingly, emotional experience is not always the first thing that's talked about in creativity research. It's often a thing about how did an idea come about? What was the process? We think putting emotional experience and affect at the center of understanding how people experience this is very, very important. So we've seen from Clive a kind of very powerful affective frame, a veil, a filter that comes across all of their collaborative songwriting. And we have some questions for you to think about now. Your emotional experiences. Can you describe what the experience of being in a really good or positive collaboration feels like? What feelings do you regularly experience on the way into a creative collaborative situation? These can be positive, negative, whatever this thing. So I think around these two tables would be nice, and other people, if you're involved at the back, please do get involved. What kind of affective framings have you experienced in good, bad collaborations? And we'll join the discussions, I think, right? Awesome. All right, I think we'll come back together, shall we, and share some of our thoughts. Shall I walk around with a mic? Do people want to share some of the things they were talking about at their table? Are your experiences emotionally framed, affectively framed? Do you have experience of particular songwriting peculiarities, perhaps? Oh, you're going to do a...
Michelangelo, have you got something to say?
Well, it's a group effort, mostly faith. For the first one, can you describe what the experience of being in a really good positive collaboration feels like? She said affirming and validating and a sense of achievement. Whereas for the second one, what feelings do you regularly experience on the way into a creative collaborative situation? She said, we said anxiety, apprehension, and preparation. Yeah.
Anxiety, apprehension, as you say, or
Apprehension, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That entering into something always is fraught in some way, and that's an affective thing. This is not this kind of like disembodied, lack of feeling, cold thing. This is this kind of not in the stomach, this kind of worry that manifests experientially that a lot of songwriters talked about. I was saying with the group I was talking to that Clive, as an example, mentioned ways in which he regulates this affective frame that can be a filter or a kind of veil over all of his creative practice, which is, I must arrive with 2 or 3 ideas in my pocket. Relying on one idea to show someone else is a way of too much risk. That apprehension is too kind of overwhelming or crippling. It undermines his kind of sense of agency as a collaborative songwriter. So thanks very much. The other group, did you...
Songwriter as risk management.
Yeah. Songwriter as risk management.
Almost as dry as organizational communication.
You can summarize it better. I don't know if I can summarize, but I think we went into some sort of a... We didn't answer the questions.
Great.
We started talking about chasing rabbits in the room while improvising. We started talking about whether there are singularities in the room who are kind of quite despotic, and they force kind of an opinion about whether the rabbit is good or bad, for example. By the end we were talking about whether there is a subject or not. So I think we just went down a path.
Yeah.
But I think it all kind of summarizes in the way that there is something ineffable and that people are able to recognize this when they work together.
That's
I think
lovely.
we all agree to
ineffable, you said.
Yeah.
But there's something in these spaces of making with other people that's ineffable. It's kind of, like you said, apparent or noticeable or something. Like that thing I mentioned, like the kind of vibe in the room. Phenomenology would say the atmosphere there.
And I think it's what we would call affective attunement, for example.
Yeah, attunement. This sense of being, atmosphere, attunement, being in a tuned space in some way where we know things should happen, where we should make music together, but there's this kind of charge to it of possibility, but also sometimes charges that undermine what's possible in there. If there's a force in the room, you think, this is kind of a barrier to us making together. That's also something that's sometimes apparent, ineffable, it's sort of touchable, but a mysterious thing. Absolutely, yeah. Simon?
I was just going to say that the direct. If I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt at the very end, the direction we were going in was towards the idea of the importance of different people's engagement, enrollment, how much invested they were in it. Because I was talking about me as a kind of producer engineer, and generally that means that I'm a lot less emotionally engaged than the musicians who are sort of doing things, and that was kind of what they wanted from me was what Clive was wanting, someone to sort of say, actually that was good, or no, that was shit, do it again, or no, that was great, do it again. Sorry, that would be the way I would put it. But that thing of who owns what, because I think with collaborative stuff, it's a lot easier to collaborate on the things that you're less invested in. It's a lot easier to be, working on the arrangement rather than on the lyrics or the melody, and that is a lot more where you see collaboration happening and people not going, no, I'm not changing that word. Sorry, that's my word. That's got to be there.
Which is hinting at this, perhaps differences that we were discussing at that table around, is there something peculiar about songwriting with other people? Like you said, committing lyrical ideas or musical ideas in a particular way, of that vulnerability of self that seems to be a novel musical idea in a songwriting context compared to perhaps some aspects of production or arrangement in some way. For the songwriters that we spoke to, there was a lot of self that was at risk here. There was a lot of self involved in the committing of these musical ideas to other people or sharing them in some way. It was really fraught for a lot of them. It wasn't a safe thing.
The other thing that we were talking about, the way people externalize the song. That the song wants this, the song wants that, or needs this, or and it's a way of depersonalizing and taking that kind of price, that cost away from you.
And that's another one of those, what we call like these kind of ways in which the affective frame is regulated. It's by sometimes, yes, having more than one idea, again, as a safety net, finding depersonalizing mechanisms about the work rather than the self in it, these kind of things. We see this all the time. Enactivism, by the way, that grand idea I told you about, the way we kind of make contact with the world, talks about the things we do to sustain a kind of healthy contact with the world, and regulating it in these ways is one of the things we do creatively. Should we move on?
I was just going to say in relation to that, I've noticed that I do, and a lot of students do, in relation to depersonalization, is use the audience as a proxy for what you think yourself. So I'll be doing something, I'll say, I think that'll be too long for people. And do you mean you don't like it? Like, I think it's too long. And students do that a lot as well. I think people will be bored. I think this chorus won't go down well. And it's a very strange way of just avoiding saying, I don't think it's good enough by my own standards. So I completely agree that's a practice.
Can you tell us a little bit about the experience level of the people in the songwriting camps? Just because I think that comes in quite a lot to it.
Yeah. So these people, it's not camp specific, this project. These are people that work in songwriting across different levels. So for some of them, they are published songwriters and producers. So I mentioned in our chat, I think 3 of them are producer/songwriters, or at least 3, where they'll go to different sessions in different functions for different days, sometimes both, writing typically for artists or for labels. Some of them are singer-songwriters, so they're artists themselves. Some of them, I'm trying to think who else is in off the top of my head. Some of them write collaboratively with 1 or 2 people in projects where they might, say, for instance, be the guitarist in a band project, but also the songwriter. So it's we wanted to get a range of types of songwriter, but they range from age 25 to 50. So there's kind of a range of demographic, but they were all but one UK-based in this study.
No, I was just wondering more like how many years of songwriting experience or working in songwriting camps, because it seems a lot of the anxiety and those sorts of things come from it being a slightly new thing or not being a new thing. I'm just trying to get my head around that bit.
It's not a really new thing for some of them, and part of the discussions were the development of this over time, actually. There's initial feelings of vulnerability in this way, but that's changed in some way, they say, or it's reoriented to a particular thing I'm kind of more nervous about or concerned with. Again, back to this strategies for regulating these kind of affective charges or aspects of risk or attachment to it were the things they did over time in their career to kind of mitigate those or to work on them. So some of them that have been doing it for quite some time professionally talked about that development of, back then I was so worried about this, now I'm more worried about this. Well, back then I was worried about that, I'm not now, but these are the other things I'm kind of interested in the way I collaborate with other people. Yeah.
What was also slightly interesting, and maybe affirming, maybe not, is that some of the people that had been doing it for quite a while said, I thought that by now I wouldn't be worried about these things, but now I'm just in different rooms worried about kind of the new person I'm working with thinking I'm not very good at this. So there's always that kind of, I think I overheard imposter syndrome somewhere earlier. There's kind of always that feeling that seems to not go away in people's experience of it.
Do you think there's, so this is a bit of an unfair question because it doesn't really have an answer, but do you think there is some kind of type that is willing to engage in this kind of research as opposed to people who are going, no, I don't want to talk about this shit?
Level of scrutiny because of, I'm guessing your methodology was robust, obviously, but they knew they were being looked at by you as well as, you know, the new peer group. Was that a factor?
I mean, there's always a consideration. Any kind of scientific act, whether you're doing like measuring people in concerts or interviewing them about their artistic practice, like songwriting, there's always that element, of course. But then you have to kind of, well, not only establish a rapport very quickly, it's a very kind of research skill-based thing, this, but also to have faith in the kind of richness of descriptions. Part of the challenge here is to prompt and probe and encourage them to elaborate on some of the things they touch on without saying, you said this, you know, interpreting for them in the moment, but allowing them a space where they can talk about their creative practice openly, freely, and I have to say, very, very rich descriptions of these types of things. And often kind of self-guided. It wasn't like, can you please tell us about this? Our questions were quite open. They were things like, please tell us about a project that you've been working on recently. We didn't say, but part of the interviews we did, yes, it involved questioning them, but we also included what we call a kind of media-stimulated part. Basically, we asked them to bring in a project. By that, we meant a track or a DAW file or something that they're working on or have worked on recently that they wanted to talk about. When we invited them to be interviewed, we said, can you also, as part of the interview, please bring a track or a project you're working on now that you want to speak about. We didn't tell them what we wanted to talk to them about, that thing. But we also had this thing where we played the track or the thing, the DAW project, and looked at it together as a way of kind of stimulating them to think about how they're experiencing that thing. It wasn't we guide them to tell us specific things about that. So it emerged. So yeah, we have to have faith that the kind of richness of these interviews suggests that we've allowed them to share quite in-depth aspects of their practice. And also, that little excerpt we showed you from Clive's interview, it's very, very frank descriptions of their experience of their professional lives.
Did you find that over time anyway, like it often starts a little bit stilted and then after a little while it just relax into it and forget the cameras are on?
What I hadn't banked on both for the interviews for this project and the book I mentioned earlier is that songwriters, most commonly their job is to be in a room with an artist, and someone described it as having a cheat code to getting to big talk, where within half an hour they'll be having conversations that you would never have with a stranger after half an hour, like talking about their relationships, their vulnerabilities, their loved ones, people they've lost, that you wouldn't do in a pub after half an hour. You'd wait at least an hour. That their job is to kind of elicit and have those conversations that they can make for someone feel comfortable, but also be good enough at sharing themselves that it feels natural and reciprocal. So I think it was kind of stumbling on a sample group that are perfectly placed to talk about experience because they're good at opening up, and they did it. There weren't many stilted interviews, and actually looking at the transcript is almost overwhelming, where the first question's asked and then it's And they don't come across, I mean, I like them all, but they don't come across as obsessed people. It's more that we said beforehand, this interview is based on rich accounts, so wherever you want to go is great by us. Don't feel self-conscious, and they did that really well.
Well, extremely generous in the way they have to kind of give ideas, musical ideas to other people in their lives, but in the interview setting like that, extremely generous in going quite deep quite quickly onto these experiential elements, which, again, remember, we did not probe straight away with really deep experience questions about emotion. We didn't do that. The wonder of this approach, which we call phenomenologically grounded research, is yes, you have some kind of intuitions from concepts and theory, but also you allow that data to guide where this thing goes, and it went to experience of this kind for them people, for those songwriters, I have to say. We're going to share one more thing, because I think one more area that came up, which was a big deal, which speaks to something actually that Adrianos has just hinted at, these kind of feelings in the room, this ineffable thing that all of them spoke about, the atmosphere in the room. These kind of creative spaces as spaces of feeling which you can kind of sense and touch, but they're shared between people. This is not purely an individual, private world of like, these are my emotions inside, but I'm noticing something between us here. We've all had this experience, right? Collaborating with someone else. There's a charge, there's an energy, there's a resonance, a hum, a fizz that's kind of shared. It's not private in some way. So I think we should go on to talk about that. I know we started a bit later, but if we perhaps go on to this idea of atmospheres. From affect theory, we might think about this affective attunement between peoples and spaces in some way. So let's skip to that, because I think that's in the interest of time. Here we are. Sensing atmospheres. Phenomenological theory gives us some really good ways of thinking about these atmospheres, these charged spaces of making together. Do you agree that creative spaces are charged in particular ways compared to a supermarket? If we ask these songwriters, how do you feel being in a supermarket? I don't think, I'm vulnerable. In the same way they do when they say, I went into a songwriting camp and I had to come up with ideas in front of people I was quite intimidated by, because they're also known as being great songwriters in some way. So anyway, atmospheres, the feeling of spaces. Atmospheres, I love this phrase, are feelings poured out into space. They're not just inside you. It's not like my private emotions. It's this thing I'm aware of which is between us. It's emerging in this space when we're making together. Atmospheres are feelings poured out into space. The calm before the storm, the fever of the limelight. These are these mystical, magical, ephemeral, but noticeable things that we have. The numinous, the wind, etc. Affective atmosphere, Anne says, are a class of experience that occur before and alongside the formation of subjectivities across human and non-human materialities. So funny how many of the songwriters who are also involved in working with producers talked about the way in which having a laptop placed in a particular way in a creative room can change the atmosphere. They sat at the laptop and turned their back to me and the room changed. It's not just that humans between ourselves when we're making stuff together establish an atmosphere. It's the things we use in a room, the lighting, carpets, plants, all these kind of climatic warmths, textures, breezes. All of this together, songwriters talked about as being important to the way in which they feel about making with other people. Here we go. Oh, here's one nice quote, because I love this one. Then we'll get on to what a songwriter said about an atmosphere. Atmospheres are not neutral. When we go in to make music with other people in spaces, it's never just like, there's nothing happening here, this is a neutral space. That anticipation, that apprehension, that excitement, it's always kind of there. And the atmospheric conditions of a space and a place play into the way in which we make with other people. They attract and repel. They amuse and horrify, enchant and become unbearable. More than one songwriter said, I've had situations where I walked in the room, we started making music, and I wanted to walk out. They repel. They're unbearable. They're also, for some people, one of the producer songwriters was talking about how the kind of accessibility and openness and fun of a space drives creativity. They're never neutral, though, in some way.
When Remy and I were in Norway in February talking with a group of students in Agder, I think we had 4 or 5 students, and we were talking a bit about atmospheres. And they spoke about this like they'd thought about it forever, and they knew exactly what we meant. One of them went, oh yeah, I can't write in that room. You can never have a good idea in that room. And the other one went, yeah, I know, that room's terrible for ideas. Like, these rooms had a quality that somehow they were very aware of. They'd never spoken about it with each other, but knew that that's the idea room, and that's the room where you just go to practice. Amazing. Oh, I'm reading this.
These feel like such obvious things to us, right, as musicians. But no one ever asked about it. And these kind of climatic, atmospheric conditions are not often the first thing that people think about in kind of creativity research either. For these songwriters, it was fundamental, i.e. Rosie. Oh, sorry, Greg, were you going to...
No, go on,
So Rosie says, there's always an energy in the room, coming off people, but also off the location, the actual room. Even the paint colour has an influence on me as a writer. At some point, I thought it didn't really have that influence on me anymore because I felt like I'd reached a certain level of craftsmanship or whatever. But I've noticed that if there's a certain vibe in the room, I'll either be better or worse at writing the actual song. And it's still a very complex journey as to why that is. I've had sessions where I felt like I'm barely having to do anything and the melodies and words just come out and roll off the tip of my tongue. And then other sessions can just be this huge, difficult, draining process where I feel like I've lost my talent and ability to write anything at all. So for us, that was a really interesting quote, this idea that this person had gone to a conservatoire, had been a professional writer for many years, and yet still they felt like atmosphere could reduce them to having nothing to say or contribute. On the other hand, atmosphere could also make it that they were working at their best kind of creative abilities. So that idea and the range of things that Rosie points out as being contributing factors to that sense of affective, creative atmosphere was compelling for us in terms of forcing that thought on how do places and interactivities and intersubjectivities between people frame creative interactions.
And what a point for pedagogy, i.e. how do we teach creativity to our students? My students are here, some of them. Rosie talked about the importance of the feeling of a space to the point where she said, I've got all these skills. If a space isn't right, my skills, i.e. technical ones, words, melodies, playing, they're still overridden. Think about what we teach in universities when we teach creativity. How would you feel, students, if I walked in and said, I'm not going to talk to you about technical matters. I'm not going to teach you how to play music better. I'm just going to say about the feeling in the room. You'd be like, hang on, this ain't right. No. But the degree to which Rosie in particular talked about skills kind of being useless in some way if that kind of atmospheric condition is not right in our professional life was really something that we need to think about, how we understand teaching things like atmospheric condition, creative collaboration around the atmospheres we have with other people, with spaces. It's huge pedagogic implications here about what kind of material we put in front of people. I know Jez was here, teaches a collaborating musician module. Where do we place the emphasis there on technique and skill of the kind that we think of being the technique and skill in music making? We have to find ways to talk about this in, properly rigorous ways with students, I think, about conditions. Extremely skilled songwriter saying, my skills, if I'm not feeling in that right space, forget them. They don't exist for me.
Just from the point about the actual room thing, I just remember there's what used to be a rehearsal room, I think it still does rehearsals, in Hackney called The Premises. And my third studio that I was building, we were looking at which room to convert into a recording space. And what was really interesting is talking to the musicians. All the rock musicians like this one particular room, all the jazz musicians like this other particular room. And because I was looking at designing the studio, I was starting to look at some of the acoustics of the space, and I realized that all the resonant frequencies in the rock room were A and E, and all the resonant frequencies in the jazz room were E flat and B flat. And it just meant that whatever they did, it sounded better because it just sounded louder, basically, in those rooms. And it was such a kind of stupidly mundane piece of information, and none of them had sort of, because you don't, when you're in a room playing, you don't think about the resonant frequencies. But it was,
but it had material
consequences. Not about the paint colour, but it was about the acoustics.
Yeah, about acoustics, we have a few questions on this. Again, an atmosphere seems an incredibly obvious thing to talk about, the vibe in the room, the relationship, the how it feels to be in that space, and yet it's not discussed at length in the way that creativity is theorized. I do remind my students, you remember I say when you walk in this room, you are already pouring out and radiating into this room. Seriously, you are. I said if I walked in kind of like this, oh, everyone. Already that attunement, that tuning of the space is changed in some ways. By the way, if you're interested in really getting into kind of the literature around atmospheres, which we are, we're working on this at the moment, it's kind of the next step here, because it was a thing that songwriters talked about a lot, these things out there and in here at the same time. You said about the subjects in the room. Who's the subject? Is the room the subject? Is the person the subject? Phenomenology, as I said earlier, is about this kind of being in here and out there all at the same time. Atmospheres as a concept, these things that are there but we notice, we're aware of, are both of those things. They're subjects and objects. They're things out there and in here. There's a whole rich way of thinking about these kind of creative spaces through the concept of atmosphere. Some of the interesting stuff comes from architecture, actually, not from music, literature. You've just done quite a bit of reading around atmospheric spaces that architects think about in really interesting ways, about building spaces that musicians perhaps just think about in these kinds of ways. I'm sure, Greg, you've been thinking about this with the Townsend studio. What is this kind of space as a thing, as well as the people in it and how they're going to behave in it as well?
I'll not riff on that because you've probably heard me do that before, but it's interesting what you said about acoustics. I wonder if that plays a bigger part than we actually think. And if a room just sounds good when you're in it, then you might not notice that the paint colour is a bit crap, or conversely the other way around. You know, the room sounds bad, but the paint's great. And it's something about that room, the bloody paint colour or whatever. Who knows? I don't know.
I think it's one of those, that subject and object thing is really crucial, where a certain group of people can make a room that's hated by another group, they can make it amazing, like that person to person. It can be. I think it's like it's this thing where the atmosphere is so all-encompassing that it's whatever works in that moment or doesn't. Like when I worked in another place, there were 10 band rooms along the same corridor, and we ran the same module 3 times in a day. And what we might call affectionately the room of doom, i.e. the one you walk in and everyone just kind of stares at you like they hate you because they're not getting anywhere, would change according to the hour slot. And it was kind of like the architectural or acoustic guidance didn't impact the room. It was sometimes how those people were using that space. So I think it's a very multifaceted experience that can have. So in your example, I guess the affirmation that comes from performing in a place that's got sympathetic frequencies to that probably makes you feel good, and that's an effective frame that then carries forward. So it depends on what, I guess, people are doing in those spaces.
There are all those studio stories of people bringing stuff into the studio to make themselves feel at home. You know, I mean, Mike Howlett talks about building a tent out of Persian carpets for Joan Armatrading that she could sit in and just be quiet before she sung anything. And I can't remember who the rock bloke who wanted to sit on his own sofa with his own stereo in front of him and play through his stereo. Stupid stories like that people talk about, but it does. I mean, it makes a huge difference to how you design a studio, and that difference that happened kind of from studio as factory to studio as cool place to hang out, that happened, are now back to it in people's bedrooms and people's homes. But
yeah,
Lachlan writes about
that use of space. It's a really interesting thing in terms of like musical pedagogy and what and how we teach. And I think that a thing that I have had to learn and had to get better at is learning that when songwriting is essentially creating something out of nothing, it didn't exist before the day, you somehow have put that into the world. That is a very different job to a lot of other musical jobs. And I think that at points, things like vulnerability and a lot of the, I guess, affective frames we've spoken about are because of how strange that role is compared to other people's. And I think sometimes we, and I previously, have misunderstood what songwriting is like. And so I think things like atmosphere, things like vulnerability and feeling comfortable in a space are really important for those things, exactly as you mentioned.
Yeah, there's a peculiarity to this, because the songwriters we talked about weren't really concerned with like how their ideas sounded in that space, in the way that you're thinking about like sympathetic frequency, or, you know, obvious examples of a certain level of reverb in the recording setting for a vocalist can be a nice, comforting, warm thing. They're presenting ideas not in that way, in a kind of recording in the moment setting of how they sound, but something about these little items, these artifacts they're coming up with and sharing with other people and interacting with still are charged in some way in that space. Not necessarily because they sound nice, but something about that interaction. The summary of this is that we always are aware of atmospheres. We are now in this room. But we often don't think about them in these ways in a formal manner in research kind of settings in the way that I think we could, and in teaching settings as well. We do think about them, but we often don't formalize or kind of take them as seriously as we could compared to other skills we see or appropriate things we need to learn about making music in a particular space. Seems for some people this is a kind of out there thing. Oh, nice atmospheres. But it matters. So we'd have to find ways to talk about these things. Yeah, done.
I think this is always something that I've thought about a lot. From starting out as a high school teacher, if you taught in certain rooms, the kids at the back wouldn't be learning because they couldn't hear you properly. So it's like down to like fundamental basic things as how does the sound ring around a room and how does that translate into intelligibility and their ability to think about this. And then we walk into universities that at best have approximated spaces that have been adapted from office blocks into creativity. And so where do you see this sort of work being more generalizable or more generally applicable?
That's for me. One of the ones that I think Remy kind of got towards there is the idea that validating atmospheres is important. I think is a good step for research, because as Remy said, sometimes, and not to group them because I kind of am one, but sometimes producers may have kind of this version to songwriters of like, just get on with it. I know the room's a bit shit, but do your thing. And that kind of lack of, sometimes that I've observed in camps, a lack of understanding that those things are needed for that person to be able to exercise. So firstly, by validating atmospheres for kind of basic creativity, I think would be really useful. Beyond that, as you say, in higher education, I've been on long campaigns for rugs, plants, and any other kind of thing that can make a studio less like a lab.
You're preaching to the converted here.
Yeah, saw the plants, great work. Oh, no problem. Similar in places where I've been trying to make those things happen, because the argument for it seems so easy that if you feel comfortable and homely, you'll feel more free to be creative. And the opposite seems much worse.
People are more creative when they're comfortable, or more creative when they're a bit on edge?
Maybe it's a discipline thing, but in every songwriter I've spoken to, comfort was like their first prerequisite.
Well, yeah, they're going to say that because it's for them. But if you're, producers all the way through the history of production have worked on ways of putting people on edge, taking them out of their comfort zone rather than putting them into it.
Yeah.
And, stupid things like, this is sort of very unwoke example, but moving Stevie Wonder's cup of tea on his piano so he couldn't find it was one of the things that the producers did in order to get the vocal for Living in the City.
Well, I think that becomes performance. Those are like performance attunements rather than the creating from nowhere.
But, well, yeah, okay, but it's about getting at the right energy in the room.
Yeah.
And they needed an edginess to the energy rather than a comfortableness to the energy.
Guy Morrow talked about it in the discussion about Boy and Bear and Joe Ciccarelli about the kind of bringing Sawyer into this, that once a group has been flowing together for a certain amount of time, they then flow into predictability, and they hire producers specifically to break them out of predictable patterns. But I'll move on.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Stevie Wonder, because I think that the classrooms of the neoliberal university have been designed for white neurotypicality, basically. And a room that changes completely the plane of potentiality in the room. And I think that's it. Like, you don't have one right atmosphere. You can have millions or infinite different right atmospheres in a room or a different room. But how does this change when you have a blind songwriter? How does it change when you have an autistic songwriter who is fielding actively in acting process at the moment, and you change like the beer can and everything changes?
And
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And that's, again, I said that phenomenology is firstly about, yes, finding out rich descriptions of individual experience, but these structures of experience, that atmospheres exist, is that structure of experience we're talking about here.
that's right.
The way that manifests for individuals within that space, that, like you said, is the difficult question then. For how you think, first you have to acknowledge that atmospheres matter as a shared experience, but not with the same quality or colour of feeling. That's a really hard thing to think about in teaching spaces, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
But if you know the way that we're approaching it in this discussion now,
Yeah.
asking these difficult questions about how do we make a space that's in one way we say about accessible as if it's a generalizable thing, but also that enables people to be able to do these things that they want to do with particularities about their needs and the way they're sensing that shared space in some way. It's extremely difficult. It's much more difficult to think about that than saying, well, we've got a full backline and PA setup. So in a way, it's quite a provocative thing to say we should foreground thinking about these atmospheres of feeling as spaces of feeling, where it's not just about emotion, but it's about what you can do in those spaces, what you can learn, what knowledge can be gained. It's a very difficult thing, but it has to happen, I think. There are huge pedagogical consequences to foregrounding affect in this way, which we think are important ones, actually. All right, how should we go about this now? How are we doing for time? We're almost up at time out. We did pose a couple of these questions, which I think now we've kind of talked about here. But I guess I do want us to talk about these things, and one of the things that comes out of this research is foregrounding this. Affect, sensation, feeling, emotional experience when making with other people, making music or other things, is not an outcome or an afterthought. Our synthesis, which is an inactive one, is that it drives. The allure of a space drives our perception in it, how it shows up for it, and as you said about potentialities, a sense of what you can achieve in a space, agency, potentiality, affordance, whichever word you want to use. We must think about these things as well as just these kind of material or processual things. We must think about them as attuned spaces in some way. Between peoples, radiating into the space, the things in the space, the climatic conditions, all of these things ask very difficult questions about what makes us feel like we're able to make with other people in some way. So placing emotional experience at the center of this is not just to look at a particular isolated dimension of our experience. It's a thing that I would argue is central, foregrounds what's achievable in a space. So our conclusions are that creative interactions between musicians, between peoples, between the materials they use, the tool they used, are affectively framed, charged, resonant, potentialities, and involve affective allure. Ideas come about because we're drawn to things, we're fascinated, we're repelled, we're disgusted, we're intrigued, we're all these things. In relation to material collaborators and environments, we often talk about creative environments. Let's talk about creative atmospheres now, is my argument, rather than just environments as if they're like these things, but atmospheres as these things. Our centres of creative agency, what's possible, and autonomy, how individually we can contribute, we can offer something, are reciprocally linked to experiences of and shifts in what's possible for us and our feelings of what's possible for us as well. Finally, these atmospheres, these both individual and shared, subjective and objective presences, something like that's a word, can enable or constrain creativity in their form as like quasi things. It's there and it's kind of not there, and it's apparent and it's noticeable, but it's not quite. Hard things to describe, but things that matter to us as musicians and clearly to the songwriters that we interviewed. Even though they avoid easy description, what is that thing? What is that vibe? What is that atmosphere? What is that feeling? What is that? Or to capture. But phenomenological method, talking to people in detail, is one way of capturing something of how people experience this stuff. They are not neutral. They are charged. They are resonant. They matter. They clearly matter to songwriters because it's one of the first things they want to talk about when you ask them about a project. There are some of the ways that we think this is not just a thing of, well, it is profound theoretical interest about atmospheres, affect, but it's about concrete reality, about lived experience and making spaces where people feel they can make. Adam.
That's the end of our conclusion slide. I think we've got some sources, but then I guess if anyone's got any questions or comments they'd like to make.
Can I
That's
just
fine.
ask
Yeah, of course.
one thing? What I'm interested in is the sort of, I suppose, the sort of philosophical problem of affect theory is the idea that it's the moment, and as soon as you're asking someone about the moment, they're reflecting on the moment rather than being in the moment, and so they're telling themselves a different narrative about it, and that thinking about kind of musical creativity in those terms, I've been in lots of sessions where people have obviously been not enjoying large sections of it, but then it comes to a good conclusion and they rewrite the story completely from start to finish about what a great day that was. I had a fantastic time. You were a bastard at 10 o'clock this morning, you know. I just wondered, does it matter? What's the kind of, does it matter that is happening and that you can't kind of decide which bit of people's affect you're getting at, whether it's some post hoc thing or some instantaneous thing? You know, we've got all these techniques that we could use to try and use stimulated recall to take them back to the moment, but they're still going back to the moment after it, and it'll be different. Does it make a difference?
You want to do a bit? Obviously, it's a limitation in terms of what methods can get you to, in terms of reliving a longitudinal perspective on something. I think the thing that we draw in our focus is the idea that we're trying to make sense of how someone makes sense of their experience. So there's almost like a double hermeneutic, where if that's how they've made sense of it and reflected on it, then that's our subject, rather than that moment where it happened. So it's trying to understand their experience of it, even if that's flawed. That is still, for whatever reason, their experience of it.
I'm also going to pick up, I'm going to go a bit detailed here on this. You said about affect theory. What we're really working with, these theories of consciousness, of how the world shows up with us. We've mentioned phenomenology, we've mentioned enactive cognitive science. I haven't actually said affect theory in that kind of philosophical tradition here. We deal with affect a lot. And I know we have colleagues here who deal with affect theory a lot. That particular branch that went away from phenomenology, actually. We're going to go to Deleuze and people. But anyway, we are dealing with affect, but we're dealing with it in a way via ecological psychology and enactivism that is very, very interested in not just how we the sensation of the world. It's very interested in how things come to matter to us. So when you're eliciting descriptions from people, even if they are after the event, they're not in the event, but the fact that it's a thing that's prominent in their experience, that they recall in a particular way, also matters. So it does say something about things that came to matter to them and remain of importance. A key concept in enactivism, and by the way, enactivism is really, this is hard, it's still concerned with perception, like why we are attending to certain things. It's much closer to that perceptual interest than some affect theory, I would say. Right, so the fact that things come to matter to people, that people care about them, the fact that whether it's the paint, the atmosphere, the plant, the musical idea, the melodic idea, that they recall it afterwards, we still have to take that seriously. It's still a kind of a present reality, a thing that's of importance to their kind of perceptual world. So dismissing it on the basis of, that was afterwards, so... not dismissing, I meant if we were to... It's such a big problem about how you get back to experience. It's not possible in that way. It's simply not. But the fact that they come to care about particular things, and it kind of is a sustained care in some way, or something of interest to them about the way that collaborator turned their back on me, and it remains in their kind of memory, it remains in their experiential kind of language when they're talking in these interviews, still matters. It suggests a kind of point of perception, or a point at which the world appeared to them in a particular way, or that collaboration had a certain thing that we still have to kind of take seriously. Totally agree. As soon as we step out of the experience, you're not in that experience. But doing the interviews, I think, is still a good way of understanding what came to matter in a particular way, that became present. And it's a really hard problem. It is the hard problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it from a sort of functional perspective, that if you're looking at this from the point of view of how can we teach this thing, then you probably do want what it's like to be there in the moment rather than the retrospective history that's been told of it.
Yeah.
Because that's a kind of reflection on how people feel about it in retrospect rather than how they could do it better in the moment.
Oh, absolutely. We're also not coming from this as outsiders. This is the other thing. How many years have you been running songwriting camps? We've been, and we did them together in Leeds, actually, at different places across Europe. We have been present as musicians in these spaces. We position this as a kind of phenomenological project with interviews, but that kind of ethnographic, if you will, kind of experience does permeate a lot of the kind of work that's happening in these fields as well. They're not purely outsiders to the practice, is what I would say here, which does shape the interpretation. It shapes some of those intuitions around this stuff. They are there, they're present. We have to kind of confront them in that way as well. I will segue to kind of other research that I'm doing, which again is about more about people experiencing music they're not making, where we do these kind of big scientific things of rigging people up physiologically to see what's happened with their breathing, with their heart rate, where they're looking, how their bodies are moving, and interview them straight after. And you can aggregate some things there about things they weren't aware of they were doing kind of corporeally with their bodies. But still I find that experiential description that comes through the interview makes sense. So much of that in the moment experience you might kind of intuit or be able to kind of speculate on through their physiological manifestations of this stuff. These interviews, I'm absolutely convinced, still matter if you do them in the right way. They don't overcome the hard problem. But what they do is get something close to understanding what comes to matter to people in a sustained way, actually, is the other thing. Yeah. Great question. The difficult one. Any other questions or comments that people have? All right. Well, I should say, formally, our two institutions, of course, but also, as I said, especially when we're undertaking interviews and travelling between countries to do this was supported during my time at the RITMO Centre for Interdisciplinary Studies in Rhythm, Time and Motion, which was funded by the Research Council of Norway, which also supported this research as well. I'm going to give a plug for your book. Adam's book with Routledge, Songwriting in the Room, is out in print now. It's a physical thing. So please do have a look at it. That's much more of a focus on, as it says, in the room collaborations. The Cambridge University Press Element that we've just finished and is currently being printed in print, in press. It's not with us physically yet, but we're almost going to get it. Is the stuff with the interview material that we talked about today. So please do reach out. So we'll be very happy to talk about some of this work with you. There are so many questions around how we deal with thinking about atmosphere so much in teaching spaces, rather than kind of the usual skills we think about when we teach music in universities. There are so many questions around the kind of theoretical angles we take. Yeah, affect theory, ecological psychology, perception, cognition. It's a very rich material base for that reason as well. So we'd be absolutely delighted to hear more about it. Yeah, all this stuff.
Element?
Yeah, cool.
The Element, when it does come out, will be open access for, I think they make it open access for 2 weeks, and then it goes behind the paywall. So the 21st Century Music Practice Network will be promoting that 2-week window, as we're doing now with Sam Bennett's one, just to say that it'll be, when you get it, you can promote it to all.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Adrianos, for organising this and bringing it together. Yeah, do reach out to us if you have any questions. And Dan and Jed, of course. Thanks, Jed. Yeah, Adam, thank you for making the trip down here to be with us today as well. It's a real joy to have you here for wildly understating also the practice and production and Nightport stuff that you do, which is, you know, on top of all this amazing scholarship you do as well. So we really appreciate you coming down. And we'll have a drink now and have a chat. So very happy to answer questions. Cheers.